Before I start the video, I want to give a huge thanks to all of my patrons, all 3 of you. Really appreciate the support. If you want to support me on Patreon for early videos, sometimes an entire week early. Also, you could just ask me any question at any time, whenever you want. Link will be in the description down below, or again, also if you just want to generally support me. And if you like this video, leave a like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to skip ahead to when the video actually skips the entire intro, gets a lot of explaining to do, this will be the timestamp right here. Let's start right away. I've gotten a lot of comments asking me to go over a version of the Marvel Cinematic Universe in a world where Marvel never sold its movie rights, and so had access to the likes of Spider-Man, the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, and all the other franchises they sold from the very beginning. And I think it is an interesting concept because, in my opinion, Marvel's success is owed to its complete failure and near bankruptcy in the 90s, which is maybe the best thing that ever happened to it, just because they had to sell all their movie rights, and leading to something like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where they had to take a lot of risks, and they had to create a universe using not their biggest names like Spider-Man or the X-Men, but some B-listers like Iron Man and Captain America and Thor. They also didn't have full rights to the Hulk, who is almost on the level of the X-Men and Spider-Man in terms of popularity before the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Nowadays, 14 years into the MCU, characters like Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, Black Widow, Hawkeye, Scarlet Witch, Doctor Strange, Black Panther, Captain Marvel, and probably the most insane is the Guardians of the Galaxy, are all just as popular, or almost as popular, and just as profitable movie-wise as the X-Men, Spider-Man, and Batman and Superman. It's kind of crazy how successful the MCU has made the Marvel Cinematic Universe and how recognizable they all are. And judging by something like the DCEU, I don't really think having access to all of your biggest heavy hitters from the start is the best thing. It forced Marvel to think creatively, and that was the best thing that could have happened to the MCU. So I do think that if they did have their rights to all of their characters, I don't think the MCU would have been as good. But I do want to look at an alternate universe where Marvel managed to get back on its feet in the 90s without selling any of its movie rights, and release their first ever movie in the year 2008 instead of Iron Man, starring the Marvel Cinematic Universe with all their biggest names like Spider-Man, the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, etc. What exactly would it look like? And I want to look at a version of that is actually successful and actually works. Just to keep things in order, I'll be basing this off of the MCU structure, even though, if I'm being honest, I don't actually think that's how it would have shaked out if that is what happened. But just going off of a one-to-one comparison, the MCU versus a version of the MCU that started out right away with its biggest names prior to the MCU, what that would look like. I think that it would have started with 4 different franchises in phase 1, starting with the first movie, The Amazing Spider-Man. Spider-Man is still Marvel's biggest character to this day, but back then it wasn't even close. In the real world, Fox and New Line Cinema managed to get out movies for X-Men and Blade before Spider-Man, before Sony did for Spider-Man, that is. But I think in a world where Marvel has all the rights and creative control, I do think they would have started with their biggest name, Spider-Man. This movie would be called The Amazing Spider-Man, and it comes out in 2008, a year at which Tobey Maguire is a bit too old to play him. So that means that Andrew Garfield, at 25 years old, would debut as the first cinematic live-action Spider-Man. And Garfield will be the main Spider-Man of this universe going forward, which is not the only thing changed by this restructuring. It's also the fact that Spider-Man is not a less experienced hero than the Avengers or anybody else. He's just younger. He started his career around the same time, or maybe even a bit before some of the other heroes, but he's a teenager, at least at the beginning of his career, so he is younger, which is different from the main MCU Spider-Man. But this is the first theatrically released Spider-Man movie, so it would be a mixture of all 3 of the franchise starters. It does follow Spider-Man's origin story with the spider bite and Uncle Ben's death. Gwen Stacy is the main love interest, but Harry and MJ are included as well. Green Goblin is the main villain, but also because we have Gwen Stacy and Green Goblin, Goblin does kill Gwen Stacy, and that is a bit of the Amazing Spider-Man 2 in there as well. But it also sets up MJ as a future love interest, which is something that Homecoming does as well. So it is mostly an Andrew Garfield focused movie, but with some of the story and the main villain of Spider-Man 1, some aspects of Homecoming as well. But for the most part it is its own thing, as it's a Spider-Man that did something that no other Spider-Man movie ever did, which is start an entire cinematic universe. Spider-Man has always been Marvel's flagship property, but in terms of actual comic sales, the X-Men were the best sellers, having the best-selling comic book of all time. If Kevin Feige was in charge, I think that he would have had the first X-Men movie focus on the original X-Men, instead of like a mix between the original X-Men and the 70s/80s X-Men, meaning focusing on Professor X, Cyclops, Jean Grey, Iceman, Beast, and Angel, with Magneto as the main villain. Some of the more popular X-Men, like Wolverine, Storm, Rogue, and Nightcrawler, who joined later, would be introduced in the sequel, except for Wolverine, who would get his own trilogy of movies, being easily the second most popular pre-MCU Marvel character, and to this day is still definitely in the top 5. Nowadays, the Fantastic Four has dropped to like 5th place in the most popular Marvel teams list due to nothing but bad movies, but pre-MCU they definitely were considered some of Marvel's most popular, and a lot of Marvel's success is owed to the Fantastic Four back in the day. Feige is at the helm and producing, so this movie would be actually good, or at least serviceable, and kick off a successful movie franchise, maybe with the same level of popularity that the Guardians of the Galaxy now have. The Guardians, however, will not be getting a movie in this timeline, because Marvel aren't forced to use more obscure characters, which some might say is a shame, but maybe they get to the Guardians in like phase 4. I would also like to sprinkle some Avengers here and there, because they will not be getting their own franchises for the most part, and I think Iron Man could fit in here, not as Iron Man but as Tony Stark, having some scenes with Reed Richards. I think that would work, setting him up for the Avengers. In the real world, Universal has specifically the rights of refusal to a solo Hulk movie, which is why I don't really know why they allowed them to make this movie. Maybe it's because Paramount owned Marvel characters back then and not Disney, but now that Disney owns them, they just say no to every single request to a solo Hulk movie, which is why The Incredible Hulk never got a sequel. Also maybe because it's the lowest grossing Marvel movie of all time, but I do think they really wanted to do a Planet Hulk movie, and they would have if they were allowed to. But pre-MCU, the Hulk was easily the most popular of the founding members of the Avengers. He had his own TV show back in the day, which was pretty popular. He had a movie in 2003, which just the fact that he got a movie at all is saying something, which is why I think he definitely would have gotten a movie in this version of the MCU. The difference here is that it's 3 years later, as they would have focused first on Spider-Man and the X-Men and the Fantastic Four, and maybe because of that it's a bit better, but what's more important is that it's gonna get a sequel. Wolverine was the second biggest Marvel character before the MCU, and he also has his own trilogy in the real world, so it's an easy decision to include him here. This movie would be a good version of X-Men Origins Wolverine without a connection to the X-Men, also no Deadpool, and a heavy focus on his time in the various wars, just because it can now connect to characters like Captain America, which his origin story does do in the comics. Captain America and Bucky would debut here and have a sizable role, not just a cameo, but a sizable role in, let's say, the first half of the movie before it moves on to more of the Weapon X focused story. 2012's The Avengers would have basically the same story, but a very different build up to it. It would be a lot more similar to something like the DCEU, where basically just one hero had his own movie, and most of the others were secondary in other movies or even just cameos, but somehow in this universe, let's just say it worked. Thor, Black Widow, and Hawkeye all debut here. Maybe you could fit Black Widow into a movie previously, but Thor and Hawkeye definitely debut here. While Hulk had his own movie, Iron Man debuted in Fantastic Four, but he debuts as Iron Man here, and Captain America debuted in the Wolverine. Basically, aside from the Hulk, the Avengers would be its own franchise without individual solo films, for like Thor, Iron Man, Captain America, or Black Widow, and Hawkeye too, but I don't really need to mention that, despite the fact that Captain America is definitely popular enough even back before the MCU to warrant having his own movie, even with the rights to all the characters. But honestly, in the 23 film structure, I couldn't find anywhere to place his or Iron Man's movies, or even Thor, which I definitely think they should have. But if I wasn't restricted by that, I do think that this movie would spin off into a Captain America movie, an Iron Man movie, and a Thor movie. Starting off phase 2, we have The Spectacular Spider-Man, the sequel to The Amazing Spider-Man. Just because I don't like movie titles that are just like 2 or 3. It could be The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but I'd rather change the title, just like the comics for Spider-Man do all the time, to The Spectacular Spider-Man. This movie could be very similar to Spider-Man 2. It works really well after the setup from the first one, where Peter is out of high school, like fresh out of high school, struggling with money, his love life, and his career as Spider-Man, with the Spider-Man No More comic being adapted, and at the same time fighting Dr. Octopus. The biggest difference is that Andrew Garfield is Peter, not Tobey, plus New York was just invaded by aliens a few months ago, and maybe they could incorporate the Vulture aspect of it, where Doc Ock's arms incorporate some Chitauri tech in there. I think that could be interesting. The second X-Men movie, called X-Men Apocalypse, would go much bigger in scale and add many more members, including Storm, Nightcrawler, Kitty Pryde, Colossus, and Rogue. I didn't mention this, but Angel died in the last movie and is here brought back as Archangel, one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver start out as X-Men villains here in this movie, before later joining the Avengers as heroes, and also they are Magneto's children. I do think that Scarlet Witch wasn't included in the X-Men movies, and Quicksilver was quickly killed off in the MCU, because they had some sort of agreement where the X-Men movies would use Quicksilver, and the MCU would use Scarlet Witch, so here they could just use both. Scarlet Witch is a part of the X-Men movies, but also Quicksilver doesn't need to die. The Fantastic Four would head to space in this movie, basically filling in the Guardian space side of the universe role of the MCU, and focusing on the Fantastic Four's adventure elements. They go to space, they go to other dimensions, they're not just stuck on Earth. Silver Surfer would be introduced, and this is Fantastic Four: Rise of the Silver Surfer, and his introduction is interesting because of his pretty big role in the original Infinity Gauntlet storyline, and the fact that he couldn't have been included in Infinity War because he was owned by Fox. This would probably also lead to Adam Warlock, who had an even bigger role in Infinity Gauntlet, being included in Infinity War. Galactus wouldn't be the main villain in this movie, unlike the real-life Rise of the Silver Surfer. Instead, I would have Super Skrull be involved, because it's a cool villain, could be interesting. The next movie is The Wolverine, coming out in 2014, or it would have come out in 2014 in this alternate universe. It doesn't really need to be different from the 2013 The Wolverine, but the only big difference being that Logan would get his yellow and blue costume, because I do think that if he's in the MCU doesn't really shy away from their comic book costumes. In fact, they have like the actual 100% comic accurate costumes, like a lot, mostly as a joke, but then they have like a more modern version of that same thing. Wolverine should 100% get that, and the fact that he had like 11 appearances in the X-Men universe and never once wore his costume, it's a crying shame. Avengers: Age of Ultron is the next movie, and it would be a bit different. For instance, Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver are not included because they're currently still on the X-Men side of things. Instead, we could add Ant-Man and the Wasp to this team because they aren't getting their own movies either. But Ultron would be the same. I mean, a lot of it would still be the same. The collateral damage aspect of it would be a bit minimized because, as you'll soon see, it doesn't really lead to anything, but a lot of it would still be very similar. And the final movie of Phase 2 is Deadpool, which came out in 2015, and it is coming out in 2015 in this universe as well. Deadpool basically exploded in popularity because of his movie, which was very successful, but he was a decently popular character even prior to it. There's a reason the movie got made. A lot of people clamored for it after the leaked footage got released. He got his own video game as well. I mean, he isn't at Spider-Man's level or anything, but he was always a popular character, and I think that they would have made this movie here. Maybe not rated R, maybe rated R. It doesn't really matter for the purposes of this video, but it would basically the same thing, just more references to the Avengers and Spider-Man, not just the X-Men. I also want to mention, because this is the end of Phase 2 and that movie would be 2015, since Daredevil started in 2015, I do think that the movie rights probably wouldn't affect the Marvel Netflix universe. Daredevil is definitely on the level of some of the more popular Marvel characters, at least pre-MCU, but I still think that he probably would have gotten a TV show. He is more suited for the TV show role. I mean, Marvel did have the rights to it, and they did a TV show in 2015 anyway, so I think that the Marvel Netflix shows would probably be the exact same and lead up to the Defenders like they did in the real world. But, you know, maybe they could have Ghost Rider show as well, because they do have rights to Ghost Rider from the very beginning. So that could be cool. If Marvel had access to both the Avengers and the X-Men, I don't think they would have been able to resist a big team-up movie. And better than that, a big fight movie, which is adapting the 2012 X-Men vs. the Avengers comic book, which the Phoenix Force is also involved in a good amount, which this movie would focus on. It would mostly be from the X-Men's perspective and act as a third movie to that trilogy, but like in the exact same way that Civil War was Captain America's third movie, so it would still have a lot of screen time for the Avengers. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver would both join the Avengers after this movie. Maybe just Scarlet Witch after Quicksilver is killed, but like I said, I don't think they would have killed Quicksilver if they didn't have to. So it is different because the Avengers never break up, but once Thanos does arrive, he's a lot more powerful in this version of the MCU because there are a lot more heroes. But still, the X-Men and the Avengers can't work together, or they aren't working together, and that is what spells their defeat. The next movie would be Planet Hulk, a movie that, like I said earlier, Marvel really wanted to make, but just Universal didn't allow them. Instead, they incorporated into Thor Ragnarok, which is all well and good, but I think it would have been a lot cooler as its own movie. I also think that Hulk has been not really used well since Age of Ultron, so this probably is something that it needed. This would be a lot more brutal and tragic than the Sakaar storyline in Thor Ragnarok, much like the comic, which is something that Hulk definitely deserves. The third Spider-Man movie, called The Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, would be a mixture between Spider-Man 3 Homecoming and a bit of Amazing Spider-Man 2. From Spider-Man 3, we do have the fact that Peter has finally found out how to live as Spider-Man, and he's also getting ready to ask Mary Jane to marry him. He's also aged naturally with the years. He started out as 16 years old in the year 2008. It's been 9 years since then, so he's in his mid-20s, like 25 years old, and he's getting ready to get married. He's a lot older now. I do think they probably would have included the symbiote by now too. They don't necessarily have to include Venom yet. I don't think they would. And yeah, you could wait till Infinity War when Peter is in space to give him this suit, but I do think that they could just do it the same way they did in Spider-Man 3, where it falls to Earth. Or maybe J. Jonah Jameson's son brings it back because he is an astronaut. It doesn't really matter. He does get the symbiote in this movie, and while Venom doesn't appear yet, he does have the black suit basically in this movie, in Infinity War, in Endgame, and then in his next movie, that's when Venom does finally arrive. So it's his main suit for a while, just like it was his main suit for a while in the comics, and it doesn't change how he acts until that last movie where Venom does debut. The Vulture is the main villain, with the Tinkerer and Electro working for him, which is mostly Homecoming, but a bit of Amazing Spider-Man 2 with Electro, and Harry Osborn is included. He's never antagonistic, but he does die in a very similar way to how he did in Spider-Man 3, which obviously leaves a mark on Peter. After that, we get a sequel to Wolverine called Wolverine X-23, which finishes the Wolverine trilogy. It is similar to Logan in the fact that it introduces X-23, who would eventually replace him as the Wolverine, and it is the third movie in its trilogy. Plus, I mean, let's just say it's probably the best one. The difference here is that it's not based off of Old Man Logan, which is why I didn't call it Logan, and he's not older. It doesn't take place in the future, it takes place in the year 2017. Also, Logan doesn't die here, but I do think that he is a contender for like the Iron Man / Black Widow roles, or even like Gamora, of dying in Infinity War / Endgame. It's like between him, Hulk, and maybe even Spider-Man. The final movie in the Fantastic Four trilogy would be called Fantastic Four Into the Negative Zone, which would focus on the Fantastic Four exploring, you guessed it, the Negative Zone, which basically replaces the Quantum Realm as the alternate dimension that leads to Endgame's time travel. It's also the reason why Fantastic Four won't be in Infinity War, but they will be in Endgame, because during Infinity War, they are trapped in the Negative Zone. The main villain would be Annihilus, who hails from the Negative Zone, so that makes sense. And also Galactus would have a cameo, setting him up as a future big villain in the MCU. But this will be the final Fantastic Four movie. There aren't going to be any more Fantastic Four movies going forward, even in like Phase 4 or in the future, but they could still appear here or there. I don't think anybody expected Black Panther to make $1 billion, but I do think that Marvel wanted to make this movie regardless of whether they had all their other characters or not. If nothing else, just for the representation, but also it does a great job at setting up the setting of Infinity War, or a large portion of Infinity War. The biggest difference here is that because the X-Men are included in this universe, Storm can be included here, as Black Panther and Storm do get married in the comics, so it would be pretty perfect. Infinity War would be even bigger here, as the Avengers and the X-Men, as well as a lot of cosmic heroes like the Silver Surfer and Adam Warlock, would be included, plus some Guardians who are not related to each other as Guardians, like Drax and Nebula and Gamora, because they're all related to Thanos in some way. Drax related to him in the fact that he wants to kill him. Thanos would have to be more powerful considering there's way more heroes, and the X-Men have some really big powerhouses, though Doctor Strange will not be included, and neither will the Fantastic Four like I mentioned earlier. Doctor Strange because he hasn't had a movie yet, and I think he could act as the Captain Marvel role here. Captain Marvel will as well, but you'll see in a second. Between Infinity War and Endgame would be two back-to-back movies which both serve the purpose of what Captain Marvel did in 2019, which is introduce a new, incredibly powerful character who, once introduced, feels like they can turn the tide against Thanos. Ant-Man and the Wasp was kind of a weirdly placed movie between Infinity War and Endgame where it didn't really do anything other than tell an Ant-Man story, and in the end they delved into the time travel aspect of the quantum realm, or rather Ant-Man just being stuck in the quantum realm. It was more so Endgame that did all of the heavy lifting for that, so I think that was a bit weird. Instead they could just have two movies in between that, yeah, it is weird that they have the same exact purpose, and then once Endgame comes around, they have these two big powerhouses that join that weren't there before, but I think at least both movies have some sort of purpose for being placed between Infinity War and Endgame. And that brings us to Avengers Endgame, which doesn't necessarily have to be all that different from the real-world Avengers Endgame. It's just that instead of Ant-Man coming out of the quantum realm to save the day by inventing time travel, you have the Fantastic Four coming out of the negative zone to save the day by inventing time travel, which Reed Richards would have a lot more hands-on compared to Scott Lang. I think the X-Men don't really have to be as involved as you would expect they would be, or at least not as involved as Infinity War, as in the 5-year gap between Infinity War and Endgame, or the 5-year gap between the first couple minutes of Endgame and the rest of it, the X-Men have formed their own state, which is something that they currently have in the comics, and that could lead into a second X-Men trilogy focusing on that, and they're busy with that. So basically the Avengers are acting alone, or rather the Avengers and the Fantastic Four. Those two teams team up, the remainder of those two teams team up to time travel. They have the whole time travel ice, they get back to the present day, snap everybody back, and once Thanos comes around, then we have the X-Men being involved as well. Honestly, I just think there's way too many characters with the Avengers, the X-Men, and the Fantastic Four to include all of them in the time heist, even after snapping away half of them. So you could just not include the X-Men that way until the final battle, in which there's going to be a lot more recognizable heroes than in the Endgame final battle, which would just be absolutely insane. In terms of the two big deaths replacing Black Widow and Iron Man, I think that Black Widow could still have that big death, or maybe even Iron Man has Black Widow's death. I don't think that Iron Man would be the big death because he didn't even have his own trilogy here. Instead, I think it could be Wolverine, which would be good because like he finished his own trilogy. You have X-23 to replace him as Wolverine. He, in this version of the world, would be one of, if not the single most beloved character in this universe, right next to Spider-Man. But there's still a lot more to do with Spider-Man going forward. He's gonna have a whole nother, maybe like 2 trilogies. So, Wolverine, I think, would be the big death of this movie. The final movie in the Infinity Saga is Deadpool 2. There was a Deadpool in Phase 2, so it makes sense there would be a sequel in Phase 3, which is 4 years later. The first one was successful, so there will be a second one. But that is the end of the Infinity Saga. Phase 4 could have things like, maybe they could introduce the Guardians of the Galaxy, a second Spider-Man trilogy, maybe a Thor movie, an Iron Man movie, a Captain America movie. That's when you get more creative because, I mean, like 2021 had 10 movies / TV shows, so you could fit a lot of things in there, especially since they already introduced a lot of the heavy hitters. You could get into, you could get a little bit more creative there. I don't think that Shang-Chi or the Eternals would be debuting anytime soon. But, you know, even that they could get to. There's 10 things, 10 franchises in 1 year. So, you could do a lot with Phase 4 of the MCU. But that's it for this video. This is what I think that the MCU would have looked like had they started in 2008 and they had all of the rights to all of their characters, with also the added rule of they have to have the exact same structure that they would later do, or they would have done in an alternate universe where they didn't have those characters. You don't have to think about that. This is just what the MCU would look like with all the characters. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought about this video. If you like this video, make sure to like this video on Patreon.